There are places where science ends and darkness begins, where reality fractures and nightmares breathe. These are the tales of Carl Otto's dark anthology. The Djinn Particle by Carl Otto. A muezzin began the call to morning prayer. Nazari stood in the barn's small washroom, studying his reflection in the cracked mirror. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his restless night. As he straightened his tie, chosen carefully to strike a balance between academic credibility and respect for local customs, he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The dream's images kept intruding on his morning routine. He'd try to focus on reviewing his research notes, only to find himself sketching that figure of distorted air in the margins. The equations he'd written beside it made a strange kind of sense. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. Amir stood in the doorway holding a thermos. "Thought you might need this. The local coffee's good, but..." He glanced at Nazari's notebook. "Bad night." "Strange dreams," Nazari replied, accepting the thermos gratefully. He hesitated, then asked, "This Ibrahim, is he tall? Wears traditional clothes, but with a modern watch." Amir's hand froze halfway to his own cup. "How did you haven't met him yet, have you?" Before Nazari could respond, a distant sound caught their attention, like metal being struck, but the echo lasted too long, resonating at frequencies that made their teeth ache. Through the barn's window, they saw Elder Mahmoud hurrying across the courtyard, his face tight with concern. "They're waiting," the elder said as he reached them. "And Dr. Nazari, whatever happens in there, try not to question their beliefs or the existence of the Djinn." Nazari turned to face Elder Mahmoud, his expression grave. "I understand. Where is the meeting?" "He has a small home connected to the cult temple," Elder Mahmoud replied. "Ibrahim insists, says the Djinn prefers it." He glanced at the mountains, then quickly looked away. "Best we hurry. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." As they walked through the village streets, Nazari noticed how people seemed to melt away at their approach, ducking into doorways or turning down alleys. Mothers pulled children inside, old men turned their backs, shopkeepers suddenly found reasons to lock their doors. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on them from every shadow. A woman dropped her water jug when she saw them coming, its clay fragments skittering across stones worn smooth by centuries of everyday life. She hurried away without meeting their eyes, making a gesture that might have been a blessing or a ward against evil. "The cult's influence," Elder Mahmoud murmured. "They control more than just the temple. Every family here has lost someone to its mysteries. A child who wandered too close, a relative who asked too many questions." A small figure darted from behind a rock, startling them. A young boy, perhaps 12, clutching a burning censer of incense. The smoke curled around him in ways that defied the mountain breeze, forming patterns that almost made sense before dissolving. "Hamid," Amir said softly to Nazari, "brother of the boy who went missing last year." His voice dropped lower. The cult found his brother 3 days later, speaking in languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries. When he finally remembered how to speak Persian again, he couldn't, or wouldn't, say what happened. Now Hamid does this for everyone who visits the temple, hoping to protect them. Without a word, the boy began circling Nazari. The fragrant smoke washed over him, while Hamid recited what sounded like an ancient Persian blessing. But there was something else in the words. Mathematical precision in the rhythm, equations hidden in the cadence. The boy finished his circuit and looked up at Nazari with eyes that held both childhood innocence and knowledge long past his years. "Be careful in there," he said in careful English. "The shadows, they don't always stay where they should. And sometimes," he glanced at the temple looming above them, "they remember things that haven't happened yet." Before anyone could respond, He disappeared down the path as quickly as he had appeared. The smoke from his sensor lingered, twisting into shapes that seemed to point toward the temple before the wind finally dispersed them. The path grew steeper as they approached the small stone house, less than 50 meters from the temple, its entrance carved directly into the mountain face. Ancient steps, worn smooth by centuries of devotion, wound upward alongside a narrow track that only the local goatherds still used. "Listen up," Elder Mahmoud said, pausing to catch his breath. "Ibrahim will try to provoke you. The cult believes that strong emotions please the Djinn. Keep your responses neutral no matter what he says." Beyond Ibrahim's modest home, the temple proper commanded attention, its massive entrance hewn from the living rock of the mountain. Ancient carvings covered its face, depicting scenes that seemed to move in your peripheral vision, figures that danced and writhed when you weren't looking directly at them. The sheer scale of it made Ibrahim's house seem insignificant. Through the house's doorway, Nazari caught glimpses of walls covered in wood panels with faces etched in them, stern elders watching with eyes that held centuries of judgment. "I see our guest has arrived," a voice echoed from within. Ibrahim stood just inside, his traditional clothes a stark contrast to his modern watch and smartphone. His silhouette stretched across the floor at an angle that didn't match the morning light. "Come, Dr. Nazari. Let us discuss why you think your instruments can measure what belongs to the divine." Elder Mahmoud squeezed Nazari's arm, a warning or encouragement, he couldn't tell which. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, like the moment before a storm. The shadows on the walls didn't quite match the objects casting them, and sometimes they seemed to move independently, flowing like dark water across the ancient stones. Ibrahim gestured to a collection of cushions arranged on the floor. His movements were fluid, practiced, a traditional host welcoming guests, but the smart watch on his wrist caught the light as he moved, its screen displaying text in rapid succession. "Please, sit," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and warning. "We have much to discuss, Dr. Nazari. Or should I say, Professor? Your work on quantum archaeology at Cambridge was interesting." A grin crossed his face, but his gaze remained cold, particularly your theories about particle preservation in ancient structures. Nazari settled onto a cushion, aware of Elder Mahmoud and Amir taking positions slightly behind him. Through the window, the temple's massive entrance loomed, its carved figures seeming to watch their meeting with ancient interest. "You've read my papers?" Nazari asked carefully. "The Djinn reads everything," Ibrahim replied, checking his watch briefly. "Through my eyes, of course. It finds humanity's attempts to quantify the divine amusing." He turned to a modern tablet mounted on the traditional wall. "Like these readings your instruments captured last month." The tablet displayed familiar waveforms, the same patterns Nazari had studied for weeks. But here, in the shadow of the temple, they seemed to pulse with new significance. "The quantum signatures are unmistakable," Nazari began. But Ibrahim raised his hand. "Quantum signatures?" A joyless chuckle escaped Ibrahim. "You see equations where you should see power, numbers where you should see glory." "The Djinn particle," Nazari pressed on, "was named after your stories precisely because of these properties, existing in multiple states, affecting time itself, transforming matter." Dr. Hassan understood there might be a connection between the ancient accounts and quantum physics. Behind Nazari, Elder Mahmoud shifted uncomfortably. The shadows in the room's corners grew deeper, more attentive. "Amir's instruments have recorded quantum entanglement on a macro scale," Nazari said carefully, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "Temporal anomalies that defy our current understanding of physics. Surely studying these phenomena could benefit." "Benefit?" Ibrahim cut him off, his practiced hospitality cracking slightly. "Like your predecessors benefited us, taking readings, collecting samples, trying to reduce divine power to numbers on a screen. His attention fixed on Nazari with growing intensity. "We found one of your colleagues, you know. What was left of him?" Ibrahim's voice grew colder. He too thought he could measure the immeasurable. The Djinn showed him other measurements. Amir shifted forward slightly. "Ibrahim, please. Dr. Nazari isn't here to—" "Silence!" Ibrahim's shout echoed unnaturally in the small room. "You forget your place, Amir. Your grandfather understood respect. He knew better than to bring outsiders to poke and prod at sacred mysteries." Nazari felt his scientific objectivity warring with growing unease. He noticed a distortion in the light next to Ibrahim, in the same space as the distorted figure from his dream. Still, he tried one more time. "The transformations we're seeing in the metal samples alone could revolutionize our understanding of—" "Understanding?" Ibrahim stood suddenly, his traditional robes flowing, but his watch face glowing brighter. "You think your human understanding means anything to a being like the Djinn? It is a primal power as old as the earth itself." He loomed over Nazari, his silhouette now stretching up the walls and across the ceiling. "Your arrogance blinds you to your own insignificance." Elder Mahmoud placed a warning hand on Nazari's shoulder as the scientist started to respond. The shadows in the room were moving faster now, more purposefully, and the temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly. "I must insist." Ibrahim moved closer, his voice carrying centuries of zealous certainty, "that you leave this place. The Djinn does not tolerate the arrogance of those who would dissect its mysteries with their primitive tools." The distortion beside him pulsed, and for a moment Nazari could have sworn he saw flames flickering in empty air. His scientific restraint finally broke. "Primitive." Nazari stood, shrugging off Elder Mahmoud's warning hand. "We're trying to understand forces that could change our fundamental grasp of physics, of reality itself. Your Djinn is displaying properties that match theoretical particles we've only glimpsed in accelerators. If you'd just let us—" "Enough!" Ibrahim's voice cracked like thunder. The shadows writhed across the walls, and the temperature plunged. "Guards!" Heavy footsteps approached from outside. 4 men entered, cult guardians in traditional dress but carrying modern weapons. Their movements were practiced, efficient. "Remove them," Ibrahim commanded. "Show our guests how we deal with those who disrespect the Djinn." Everything happened too fast. Nazari felt rough hands grab his arms. He tried to pull away, but one of the guards struck him hard across the face. He tasted blood. "Stop!" Amir moved to help, but another guard slammed him against the wall. Elder Mahmoud raised his hands. "Ibrahim, this violence is unnecessary." But the guards were already dragging them toward the door. Nazari struggled, earning himself another blow, this one to his ribs. Through blurred vision, he saw Ibrahim watching with disgust, the distortion beside him now clearly flame-shaped, its edges rippling with ancient malice. They were thrown roughly onto the stone steps outside. Nazari landed hard, his scientific equipment scattering across the ground. One of the guards deliberately stepped on his laptop, the crunch of electronics mixing with Ibrahim's final words. "Let this be a warning. The next intrusion will be dealt with far less gently." The heavy door slammed shut, leaving them in the cold mountain air. Nazari tried to stand, wincing at the pain in his ribs. Amir helped him up, while Elder Mahmoud gathered the broken remains of his equipment. The walk back through the village felt longer than before. Each step sent fresh pain through Nazari's ribs, and he could taste blood from his split lip. The villagers who had avoided them earlier now wouldn't even look in their direction, hurrying inside at their approach. The morning sun cast long shadows across their path, and somewhere in the distance, a muezzin's call to prayer echoed off the ancient stones.